talk. Sorry about that. And sorry about the cheap prop. Let me just get my presenter. Okay, so I'm here to talk about games. And my name is Johnny, and I'm an addict. And that's what made me start thinking about this. And I also read this article in a magazine called Grad Psych, which is the American Psychology Association's graduate student magazine, in which they put forward video game design as a hot career for aspiring psychologists. Now, this reflects a trend that's been going on for several years now, where psychologists are increasingly being hired by video game companies in order to make games more challenging, more compelling, and fun, or perhaps more realistically, to make them more profitable. So I started also reflecting on my own addiction and started wondering, is this something we need to be worried about? Now, on the one hand, there's nothing new here. Psychology has been exploited in gambling, in politics, in advertising for literally thousands of years. So is there something to worry about? And I think there might be, actually. I'm usually a techno-optimist, but we need to be a bit aware. And the first thing we need to keep in mind is that games are different. Games allow for something known as operant conditioning, as opposed to classical conditioning. And as every psychology student in this room knows, these are two fundamentally different types of learning. With classical conditioning, you have an existing relationship between a stimulus and a response. For instance, when a dog gets food in its mouth, it starts drooling. Then, if you consistently pair that first stimulus with another neutral stimulus, for instance, ringing a bell, and you do this consistently, then eventually the dog is going to start drooling just by hearing the sound of the bell. Now, that's classical conditioning, and that's the kind of stuff that advertisers exploit when they make you believe that a particular brand of jeans is going to help you get laid. Operant conditioning works quite differently. With operant conditioning, you can create associations between any type of behavior and the reward or punishment that follows. To put it very simply, and I'm going to qualify this in a second, if you do a certain type of behavior and you get a positive reward, it's likely that you're going to repeat that behavior. If you get a negative reward, you will probably not do it again. This is a fundamentally different type of learning, and first of all, because it requires interactivity. So if you look at a pigeon, when the pigeon, by random trial and error, comes across the fact that pecking a button will give it food, it will eventually learn this. So pecking a button, which is completely unnatural for most pigeons, now becomes a part of its behavioral repertoire. Now, why is this different? Well, first of all, this is a tremendously more powerful way of changing behavior. And like I said, you have to have interactivity for this. You don't get it from advertising, typically. You don't get it from political rhetorics. You do get it from interactive games. And you do also get it in the casino and from slot machines. And that in itself is enough to say how powerful this can be. In the words of B.F. Skinner, who really demonstrated how powerful this was 50, 60 years ago, this can take a rare response, turn it into a high probability in a very short time. But still, do we need to worry about this? We have had games for 50 years now, but yes, games have changed tremendously. And I don't want to sound like an old fart, but games are not like the way they were when I was a kid. When you bought a big cardboard box with tons of floppy disks, and your main objective was to finish the bloody game. You played it typically on your stationary PC, and you were typically isolated from everything else. Now, if you look at the games that have become some of the most popular games the last 5 years, they are typically free to play, so you can play them freely, instantly. You don't pay up front, but you pay through microtransactions throughout the game. You also have several achievements throughout the game, so you don't have to finish the game necessarily. You typically play it on your mobile or your mobile devices, and it's typically integrated in social media platform. Now, this changes the game, no pun intended, enormously for game designers. They need to find new ways to get gamers hooked. So they have to employ a particular type of operant conditioning, what is known as variable ratio reinforcement. The best way to teach somebody something is to have a predictable relationship between the behavior you engage in and the reward that you get. Eventually, you will then get these kinds of curves. You get increased activity when a reward is imminent, and then you relax once you get that reward, and you sort of have a reduced activity until the next reward is going to be imminent again. If there is no pattern between what you do and what kind of reward you get, you tend to get these kinds of curves. Steady activity, no pauses. And if it's done right, so to speak, you can induce serious obsessive behavior by only alternating the payouts all the time. And you'll recognize this from slot machines and casinos, of course. Now, what's the problem here? Well, the problem is that with new games, pausing equals multitasking. So these pauses are exactly the kinds of pauses that the game designers want to avoid. And the reason is because pauses now don't mean that you stop playing. It means that you switches to the other game that you got running in a separate tab, or that you got running in the background of your smartphone or your tablet. So game designers increasingly need to employ clever ways of using operant conditioning in order to get gamers hooked, in order to get obsessive-like behavior. But is this a problem? Like you're obsessed with a game, you're hooked on a game? Isn't that the whole purpose of playing a game? Well, not necessarily, because obsession doesn't necessarily mean that you're having fun. Now, at this point, I could do a big song and dance about neuroscience and how there are separate areas of the brain dealing with desire and pleasure. You might have heard that dopamine is the pleasure chemical. It's not really. It just makes you really, really want something, even if you get no pleasure out of it. But instead of showing you research papers and statistics and all that, let me illustrate this by means of lolcats instead. So the cat on the left really desires a cheeseburger. It wants a cheeseburger, almost regardless of whether it gets pleasure. The cat on the right already had a cheeseburger and is really pleased. It got a lot of pleasure out of it. Probably also a couple of beers from the looks of it. Typically, you can observe whether somebody is desiring something or whether they're getting pleasure out of it. The problem with games now is that game designers now have a unique way of observing player behavior, and a very one-sided way of observing player behavior. They have real-time access to how many hours their customers spend. The problem is that they don't often see what's going on behind those hours played. Is it hours played obsessively, or is it hours played with pleasure? And when game companies become too obsessed with this, they tend to reproduce the game mechanics that they see leads to a spike in hours spent gaming. Now, this is also a bit problematic, because the more you play, the more likely you are to pay, and that's what is driving this development. And this rests on a very, very simple formula: time equals money. So when you start a free-to-play game, you feel that you're actually saving money because you're working instead of spending money. Yeah, type on the slide, sorry about that. Everything in society revolves around time equals money. But the key thing is that this works the other way around as well. Money also equals time. And the thing is, when you spend many, many hours on a game for free, you start to get the illusion that this is a meaningful activity. After all, you cannot admit to yourself that you wasted all those hours on something meaningless. Once it becomes meaningful, then it becomes much more likely to spend money on it. So you start out saving money by working instead of paying, and then, when it becomes meaningful enough, then you start saving time by paying instead of working. And then if you add to this all kinds of other confusing things, such as 6 berries equals $4.20, you have no chance to really do these kinds of real-time calculations either. So this is the way they hook you into this. If you can add to this some kind of social element, it becomes even more obsessive. And this is where we enter the weird world of social psychology and social comparison, which is one of the strongest motivational factors game companies can use. The key thing to really tap into is something known as benign envy. So malicious envy is when you're envious of somebody else's success and you believe their success is undeserved. Benign envy, you're also envious of somebody else's success, but you believe that their success is deserved. That's a much more motivational thing and will drive you to play more. But when you're competing on a global leaderboard with all kinds of elite players, and their scores are way beyond what you could probably do, and you have no idea whether it's deserved or not, it's much more motivational to play against your friends, against your mom, and so on, because then you have a much better idea of whether they are cheating or not, whether it's deserved, their scores. That leads to much more motivation for gamers, and again, you spend more hours, and you become more likely to spend money. But of course, we have willpower, right? We can sort of restrain ourselves. No. Willpower is not unlimited. Psychologists refer to this as ego depletion. And the weird thing is that every time you spend willpower, you have a little less willpower left. So when you're grinding and grinding and grinding in a game because you don't want to pay for it, you try to restrain yourself, at some point your willpower reserve is gone. It's not unlimited, and then you become much more likely to pay for the game instead. Now, unfortunately, TEDx is also not unlimited, and this ticker is ticking awfully fast. So I don't have time to go into all the fantastic effects that psychology can exploit in order to get gamers hooked on their games. These are just a few of the many, many effects that can quite easily be implemented in games. But let's try to be a bit more constructive instead. So how can we deal with this? Well, I basically think there are a few people who need to start asking themselves some questions. First of all, policymakers. When these games exploit the same mechanisms as casinos and slot machines, when there's tons of money involved, there are often personal and financial tragedies. Policymakers should ask themselves, is this something we should regulate? And then quickly answer that question, but no, do not regulate this. You can't regulate it. Certainly not without losing out on all the fantastic things that games do have to offer. Let's turn to game designers. I think game designers need to ask themselves, is this why you started making games in the first place? Was it only to make games profitable, or didn't you have an idea originally to make games memorable and fantastic adventure that you will remember 10, 20 years later? I'm still talking to friends about Grim Fandango, which is one of the greatest experiences I've ever had. So game designers need to ask themselves that as well. This brings us to game psychologists. This might be a bit harsh, but I think game psychologists actually have to ask themselves, are you really psychologists? To paraphrase what Plato once said, you're not a doctor if you have loads of knowledge about how the body works. You're only a doctor if you put that knowledge to good use. And the same goes with psychologists. And if you look at the American Psychology Association Code of Ethics, it explicitly states you should strive to benefit those with whom you work and to care to do no harm. You have a scientific responsibility. You have to be on guard against personal, financial, and other factors that might influence or lead to misuse of your influence. And you have to, most importantly of all, take care that you do not undermine people's self-determination. And that's exactly what we're talking about here. This brings us to gamers. Gamers also need to ask themselves, are you having fun? When you are looking for pigeon number 200 that you need to kill in order to get an achievement, are you really having fun? When you're grinding hour after hour after hour just to level up, are you really having fun? It might be the case that you are, and that's fine, then just go on. But please ask yourself this question at least, because there is a chance that there are psychological effects that lead you to play when you're not actually having fun and you're actually having a miserable time instead. But how can you know? How can you know when you're manipulated? How can you really know when you're having fun or not? It might sound like a weird question, but it's a very important one. Well, this has to do with education. And this brings me to my most important point. The ones who really need to ask themselves something are educators. Why do you not teach psychology to children? As many of you will have noticed, most of the things I've talked about today are Psychology 101, very simple, basic psychological principles that you could easily teach to children. And regardless, what other age would you benefit more from understanding human motivation than when you go through your teenage years? So teach children psychology, teach them when they're having fun and when they're being manipulated, and then gamers will make more conscious choices, game designers have to adapt to this, and we can get a much better world with much better games. Thank you.